good evening. I'm Wendy Wasserman, and I'm the Community Sales Manager at Politics and Prose Bookstore in DC. And welcome to P&P Live tonight, and a special thanks to our partners, Books and Books, the Miami Book Fair, and the Harvard Bookstore for bringing this event together, which I know is going to be a super evening. And on behalf of indie bookstores everywhere, thank you for continuing to support us for this evening and continuing to buy books. And as Andre and Jennifer and I were just talking about, for all those authors out there, continuing to write books so we can sell books, so you can buy the books. I know this is going to be a terrific conversation between Jennifer and Andre. And do yourself a huge favor and pick up a copy of Mercy Street. It's out this week, and it is the prettiest thing I've seen all day. So it's wonderful. For those of you who are veterans of these events, you know that your mic is unmuted, and we are taking questions through the Q&A box. So that's at the bottom of your screen. Pop your questions in there so Andre can see them later. You can also upvote if there's a question there that really tickles your fancy. And if you need closed captioning, we also have that available. You can turn that on at the bottom of your screen. So those are the announcements. Let's get to business and tonight's discussion of Mercy Street, which, as I said, was published this week. So it's a big week for Jennifer. It's been getting incredible reviews, including Richard Russo, who in the New York Times book review called it, quote, a wonderfully entertaining, boasting a large, varied cast of vividly drawn characters whose company readers will find deeply rewarding in no small part because lurking in their shadows is the devastatingly wry humor of their creator. Haigh is paying close attention to their choices, large and small. That's not artifice, it's art, he said, and I was gobsmacked. Can't get better than that. So we are thrilled that Jennifer is joining us tonight. And in addition to Mercy Street, she is the author of the short story collection News from Heaven and 6 best-selling and critically acclaimed novels, including Heat and Light and Faith and Mrs. Kimball. Her books have won both the Penn Hemingway Award for debut fiction and the Penn L.L. Winship Award for work by a New England writer. Her short story fiction has been published widely and in the Atlantic and Granta, the Best American Short Stories, and many other places. And she's joining us from Boston. And she will be in conversation with Andre Dubus. He tutored me on this earlier and I've already messed it up. Andre's 7 books include the New York Times bestsellers, House of Sand and Fog, The Garden of Last Days, and his memoir, County. His most recent novel, Gone So Long, has been named on many best books lists, including the Boston Globe's 20 best books of 2018. He's been a finalist in the National Book Award and has been awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship, the National Magazine Award for Fiction, 2 Pushcart Prizes, and is a recipient of an American Academy's Arts and Letters Award in Literature. His books have been published in over 25 languages, and he teaches full-time at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell, and he is also joining us from the Boston area. So they are taking time out from a very chilly evening to be with us tonight. So take it away, guys.
Wendy, thank you. And again, thank you, Politics and Prose and Harvard Bookstore and Books and Books for hosting this wonderful event. Jennifer Haigh, congratulations on just another superb novel. Yes, Mr. Richard Rousseau was totally correct. It's entertaining, but I think he would agree that it's also deeply compelling, and like all of your novels, just so relevant and timely, and frankly, particularly in this case, brave. You wade into some really perilous territory here. Perilous in that, I'll let you speak about it, but we're talking about abortion rights and women's health care and many, many other layers to this really mesmerizing and beautifully written novel. My first question to you is, where did this spark begin for this novel?
Well, Andre, this book really grew out of an experience I had volunteering at a women's clinic here in Boston. And I started doing this work not because I had any notion of writing about it. I really didn't. I did it because I believed in the work this clinic was doing. And for me, it really was an education. You know, I have been in favor of abortion rights for as long as I can remember. But this really deepened my understanding of why this is so crucially important. I realized when I started writing this book that I was doing cartwheels down the third rail. And I never really lost sight of that in the writing of it. In fact, about a year and a half ago, when I was close to finishing the book, I kind of had this moment of like, what was I thinking? Why did I think this was a good idea? It seemed it seemed like a really dangerous and unwise thing to do, but I was so far into it by that point and so believed in the book that I had no choice but to finish it. But I managed to sort of block that out for most of the writing of it, which is how I was able to finish it. I mean, you know yourself, you really need horse blinders when you're writing these things. If you stop and think about, you know, how critics will view them or how readers will view them or how your mother will view them, forget it, you'll never write another word. So I really have to write telling myself that no one's ever going to see this. And I can convince myself of that for a while. And then at a certain point, reality intrudes. So that's kind of what happened with this book. By the time I really wrapped my brain around what a dangerous thing it was too late to turn back. I'm glad I didn't. But so that's where the story came from. I'm going to read a little bit from early in the novel, not too much because I know on Zoom it's a little tricky. I'm going to read from the first chapter of the book. The main character, Claudia, who's a counselor at this clinic, is looking out the window and counting the protesters outside. And of course, those protesters are the daily reality at these clinics. They're there all the time, rain or shine. So here we go. On a frigid Wednesday morning in mid-February, a crowd gathered in front of the clinic, their backs to Mercy Street. Claudia stood at a second-floor window in the staff kitchen, counting heads. 36, she said. Seen from above, the group looked organized. They stood in concentric circles like the growth rings of a tree. In the center were the professionals, archdiocesan priests in slick nylon dress slacks, a few monks from the Franciscan monastery in New Bedford, the tails of their brown robes peeking out from beneath winter coats. In the outer rings were the regular people holding rosary beads or carrying signs. Did you count those guys in back? Asked Mary Fahey, the nurse practitioner. A few lurkers stood at the margins, staring at cell phones like bored strangers at a bus stop. Whether they were protesters or indifferent bystanders was impossible to say. No, said Claudia. I wasn't sure about them. 36, she felt, was a sizable number. In their bulky coats, they might have been carrying anything. There were 12 staff working at the clinic, except for Luis, the security guard, all female, all unarmed. So that's where the story begins. The story opens on Ash Wednesday, the first day of Lent, and there's a good crowd of protesters assembling outside, and they will be there every day for the rest of Lent.
When you volunteered there in your real life, Jennifer, did you see that? Was that one of the opening? Was that the image that began it for you? Was the protesters outside the workspace every day?
Yeah, every day. I mean, some days there was a whole bunch of them, and some days you'd see one guy. There was one guy who would come every single day. He's in the book. I don't know anything about him. I never knew his name, but that guy is in the book. He never failed to show up, regardless of the god-awful Boston weather. He was there every single day. And you know, it's part of the daily if you work at a clinic. I was just a volunteer. I wasn't there every day. But I think about the full-time staff there, that this is just something you're going to face every morning when you go to work. And it becomes routine, but you know, I don't think it can possibly become normal, because a lot of these protesters are not very well behaved. They're sometimes abusive, they're often angry, they're scary, and they're there every single day. And so when I started writing this novel, this was the first scene I wrote, actually, the protesters outside.
Wow, and it ends up being the first scene in the novel. That's rare, right?
Yeah. It's never happened to me before.
I want to talk to you a bit about actually, I would like to talk to you a lot about your process. I admire your work so much. And we'll talk more about your body work if we have time. But in a recent interview, or actually it might not have been recent, you say this: for me, writing a novel is an exercise in empathy. If I can't imagine being these people, I shouldn't be writing about them. Well, I really want to talk about that because this novel is told from 4 points of view primarily, right? We've got Claudia, the woman who works in the clinic, really our main central character, but there are 3 men as well. Timmy, her weed dealer, and a man named Victor Prine, who drives around when he's not driving a long haul truck, he drives around and sticks pro-life signs all over wherever he can. And of course, there's Anthony, who's got a brain injury, who does Victor's bidding. I won't give too much away. But one of the things that occurred to me that I think is such a remarkable high wire act you achieve in this novel, Jennifer, is, you know, you could argue that at least one of those men is a rabid misogynist. And you embody him with such humanity. I felt I was just getting to know a man with some hateful qualities, but I didn't feel you judging him as a human so much as maybe judging his view of the world. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's I think a basic rule for me in writing any character, and it's the magic of point of view, that when you're writing from a character's point of view, you must take his side in that moment when you're writing the character. Even if you don't agree with him about anything, even if he holds views that you find repugnant, you still have to make common cause with him in order to write him fairly. In other words, you try and write this guy the way he'd write himself. You know,
that's a great way to put it. I haven't heard it put that way.
It's true, though. It's, you know, very few of us think of ourselves as bad people. We sometimes acknowledge we make mistakes or we do something bad, but we generally don't think of ourselves as villains because we understand our own motivations. And that's exactly what you have to do in writing characters. It's kind of like being an actor. You know, actors don't pass judgment on the characters, they become the characters. And as a writer, you have to do that exactly. You have to become the characters for at least that period of time when you're writing from that point of view.
All right. I know I want to spend more time talking than reading, but can I read 2 short paragraphs from your novel from this man's point of view? For decades now, the white female had defied nature, fighting her destiny with every weapon possible, swallowing pills, injecting herself with hormones, shoving tiny pieces of copper up inside her to keep a baby from implanting. Implanting, that was the word used. Victor had read about it on the internet. The depravity was breathtaking. The depravity truly was hard to fathom. And there were other consequences. Just think of the urine. All over the world, untold millions of females were jacked up on estrogen. Each time one took a piss, a dose was released into the water supply. By now, every drop of water on Earth had cycled through some female's bladder, a thought that haunted Victor each time he turned on the tap. And he goes on and on. And on one level, it's tragically funny. It's darkly comic. It's bizarre. And yet on another level, it's deeply disturbing, this look at the other. But you did it. And I love the way you just put it. How would he write about himself? I don't know if he would have that self-awareness, right? But you do, thank God. Can we talk about place? In all of your novels, thank God, it is such a viscerally alive part of all of your work. As alive as the characters, from Bakerton and Baker's Towers, and Boston and Faith, Boston the Condition, Heat and Light, Bakerton again. You return to Boston in this novel, Mercy Street. Can you tell us why Boston and not Miami or San Francisco?
There are so many reasons why this story could only happen in Boston. There are obvious reasons and less obvious reasons. The most obvious reason probably is the weather. And if you've read the novel, you know that the Boston winter is a central character in this book. It takes place in the winter of 2015. commonly referred to as the snowpocalypse in Boston. I think everybody who was in Boston for that winter still has PTSD from it, myself included. When it started to snow the other day, I started to lose it, actually. And I've never been afraid of the snow, but that winter just about broke me. And I realize part of our audience is in South Florida tonight and they're cackling, but it's true. We live with this threat every year. And this novel opens in February of 2015, just when the snow started flying. And that pervasive feeling of winter, the danger really of that winter is present throughout the story. So on the surface, that's the first bit of it that is so very clearly Boston. Another piece of this story it's maybe less overt in the novel. Part of what's happening in 2015 in Boston is the aftermath still of the clergy sex abuse scandal, which we are still living, and which I've written a whole novel about. It's something I know something about. I think the clergy sex abuse scandal has forever changed Catholics' relationship to the church in Boston. I mean, church attendance has dropped sharply and it has stayed depressed. It has never quite come back. There are lots of smaller parishes that have been closed or merged with other parishes. So there's a real hangover from that scandal in the city of Boston. And yet, when it comes to abortion, a lot of these protesters are Catholic clergy. And the novel poses this question implicitly: what is the moral authority of the church on any matters to do with sexuality, given what we now know about the Boston Archdiocese and really, I mean, every Catholic diocese, it seems these stories are legion, they're everywhere. And so it's Boston as the intensely Catholic city, it still is, even in a vestigial way. It has a resonance in this story. It matters.
Boy, it sure does. And that shows itself, I was going to say pathetically, but I guess I mean pathetically from the point of view of Anthony, who's suffered a brain injury, who lives in his mother's basement. You want to talk about, I'd love to know the genesis of Anthony, if you remember, if you recall. Did he, and I'm also interested in talking about a little bit, Jennifer, so it sounds, I'd be willing to bet you don't think thematically and then inject the themes into the narrative, but I have a hunch they come, can you talk about that too? You know, we're talking about the lack of moral authority of the Catholic Church because of rampant pedophilia, institutionalized, et cetera. But I bet you, knowing you a little bit, you're not thinking that when you're writing the novel, but it comes from the characters, or what? How does it happen for you?
You know, it's funny. I never had that thought when I was writing the novel. It was only working through the final draft that it even occurred to me that that's what I'd written. You know, a book becomes a book in the process of writing. It's not, for me, something that I conceive of thematically and then execute. You know, it's built very slowly. It's this process of accretion. And only when I have the whole thing in front of me can I take a step back and say what it's about. So it's a kind of thing that's, it's the subconscious writing a lot, I think.
Do you know where in your, do you know, excuse me for interrupting, do you know where in your subconscious Anthony and Timmy and Victor Prine came from? And Claudia?
Wow. I mean, Claudia is the easiest to answer. I can source that. That comes from my experience working in this clinic and getting to know some of the people who made a career of working in this clinic, that it was their life's work. It was not mine. So that's where Claudia comes from. The other characters, it's less clear. Victor Prine, who is kind of the antagonist to Claudia, as Andre said, he's a long distance trucker who is, you know, on the side, plants these anti-abortion signs wherever he goes. Now that character really comes out of where I grew up. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, it's Northern Appalachia. And in the small town where I grew up, it was a very common sight, these anti-abortion signs along the highway, in people's yards. They've been there my whole life. They're still there. You know, I was back there 3 months ago. They're still there. Of course, they'll never go away. It's a small town, socially conservative, intensely Catholic. My family was very observant. I went to 12 years of Catholic school. You know, I knew abortion was evil before I understood how you got pregnant. I mean, I remember being 6 or 7 years old and being talked to about abortion and trying to wrap my brain around what this even was. Mm-hmm. So it was very natural for me when I'm writing the antagonist to Claudia that it would be a character from my part of the world. And Victor Prine is from my part of the world. He is from this fictionalized town of Bakerton, which is a place I write about a lot. I've written 3 books set there. It's very much modeled on the little coal mining town I grew up in northern Appalachia. And that's where Victor Prime is from. So he was not a hard character for me to write. I feel like I've known this guy my whole life. Now, I haven't known his deepest, darkest thoughts, but I've seen him around. You know, I've seen him at the lumberyard. I've seen him at the hardware store. I know that guy.
And
He wasn't hard to write at all.
he also listens to Doug Strait, talk radio, right-wing, hateful, bigoted man. Was there a figure in particular upon whom you based that character?
Well, no, I mean, I think there've been lots of
There are plenty of his, yeah.
Doug Strait type figures. But, you know, the thing I want to point out is part of the power of talk radio and the reach of talk radio is a lot of working class people listen to the radio at work, and very few white collar people do. You know, if you work in an office, if you're an attorney or a physician, or you know, you're not listening to the radio all day long. If you drive a truck, you know, if you're a roofer, if you're laying drywall, the radio's playing. That's who listens to the radio all day long. And if you're a long distance trucker, you bet you're listening to the radio. So, yeah. You know, that's how Victor Prime discovered this guy, Doug Strait. It was company when he was working. It's really a very lonely life. And that was the voice that kept him company all day long in all those years of driving.
Yeah, it rings so true, Jennifer. And as does Anthony. And you know, we don't have to give all away. People can read the novel and discover Anthony as they go. But one of the things, I was about to say themes, but it's not accurate. One of the experiences you return to again in this novel, and I'm always so gratified to see it, because I don't think it gets written about enough, is social class. And frankly, poverty, real poverty. Could you talk about that? Is it something that you're conscious that you're doing? Do you feel yourself falling into it again? Claudia grew up poor in Maine. Talk about Claudia, if you would, and the mother who gave her life and what her life was like in Claiborne, Maine.
Yeah, well, you know, I feel that every book I've ever written is about class in some way. And it's a function of where and how I grew up, of course. Andre and I have this in common. It's a subject that interests us. We're people from a working class background. A lot of writers of literature don't have that experience, and so it doesn't show up in their work. That's natural. We all write what we know deeply, what is significant to us, what is familiar to us. And so that's why I'm always writing about working class people. Claudia, as Andre said, grew up in rural Maine. She was born to a single mother. Her mother was 17 when Claudia was born. And the fact of being raised by a single mom in really difficult material conditions has been formative for Claudia, as it would be for anyone. It has really informed her ideas about what family looks like, what motherhood looks like, and what the lives of children are like if they are not born into great circumstances. Claudia's mother, to make ends meet, takes in foster children. So all through Claudia's childhood, she's one of 3 or 4 kids who come and go periodically. You know, typically when their mothers get out of jail, the foster kid will disappear and be replaced by another foster kid. So Claudia's understanding of the lives of unplanned children is quite different from somebody who didn't grow up in that way. And you really see these questions of class play out at the clinic where she works. The clinic where I volunteered, I have to say, was probably the most integrated space I have ever entered in the city, because you know, these are questions that women from all walks of life are dealing with: contraception, abortion, you know, basic healthcare, basic gynecology. If you live in a female body, these are things that you have to care about, regardless of your background, regardless of how much education you have, or what race you are, or what sort of family you are, or what part of town you live in. We all have to deal with these things. And this clinic was a place that everybody came to. You know, there were very accomplished professional women and teenagers and women with kids, women without kids. So it was a real crossroads. But in the novel, you see how this question of unplanned pregnancy plays out differently for different women depending on your circumstances. There's one patient who comes to the clinic who is a senior in high school. She goes to prep school. She's in the process of applying to college, and she's trying to decide between Dartmouth and Princeton. That's where she's at. And she finds out she's pregnant. So her mother makes the appointment for her, comes with her to the clinic, and is fully supportive of her daughter's decision to end this pregnancy. In fact, the mother even confesses to Claudia that she herself had an abortion when she was around the same age as her daughter is now. That experience is quite different from some of the other patients who turn up at the clinic. There is one young woman who is pregnant for the third time. She is a homeless addict. Her pregnancy was detected when she was found in a gas station restroom having overdosed on heroin. In the emergency room, they did an ultrasound and found that she was pregnant. That's how her pregnancy was detected. And so she comes to the same clinic as the prep school girl to terminate her pregnancy. So Claudia sees this on a daily basis, how unplanned pregnancy means very different things for different people, depending on who you are and where you come from.
Jennifer, how long ago did you volunteer at the clinic from this date?
It's been a few years.
10, 15, 20 years?
Less than that.
Okay, my question would be, did you find yourself, I mean, because those sections of the novel, well, the entire novel is so compelling, but those sections are particularly moving because you do see the stratification of class. You do see the kid who's looking at it, you know, is it Princeton or Yale, whatever it was, boo-hoo, as opposed to some other dire straits. My question is, they seem to come organically from the dream world of the clinic as you're writing it. They didn't feel like research field work characters you punched into the narrative. And so I'm just curious about your process there.
I did zero research for this novel, and I often do a lot. My last novel, Heat and Light, had to do with fracking in Pennsylvania. And wow, I spent a whole year doing research before I could write anything. And this isn't that kind of book. It's a more internal story, and it is much more drawn from an experience I had being at this clinic. It's more drawn from what I observed while I was there. There's a certain degree of imagination at play, of course, in any fiction you write. These characters are all creations. Not one of them is based on an actual person, but they're all sort of suggested by people I've run across in the course of my life. You talked about Anthony earlier, and he's somebody we should say a few words about. He is he's a guy who goes to the same weed dealer as Claudia. That's their connection. They buy weed from the same guy. Anthony's a guy who suffered a traumatic brain injury when he was working on the Big Dig. That he got his eggs scrambled, as Timmy says at one point, and his life has never really recovered. So he's still, at 40 years old, living in his mother's basement. He's not able to work. He's living on disability. And the only thing that eases his vertigo and his headaches is smoking pot. So, that's the way he connects with the other characters in the book. Anthony was very moving to me because he's really a person who has no community. And for him, the appeal of Catholicism, the appeal of church going has a lot to do with community. And, I think that is one of the very, one of my most cherished memories of growing up Catholic is that there was genuine community. I'm not someone who describes myself as a recovering Catholic at all. There was nothing to recover from. I had a wonderful Catholic childhood, and it was extremely nurturing, and I'm grateful for it. And Anthony had that same sort of childhood. And so when I'm writing about religion, it's important to me to show the full picture of it, not simply the excesses or the parts of it that are disagreeable or hard to handle, but also the beauty of it and how much it brings to people's lives. And that's part of what Anthony does in the book, that it shows you what has been lost, but this loss of faith, this loss of community.
But I think that's the strength of your work as a writer, I think, in broad terms, Jennifer, is that you never paint anything in a fundamental black and white way. Even when we're writing from the point of view of Victor Prine, when you are, he's hateful, he's misogynistic, he's full of fear, he's full of terror, and he gets dangerous, and he heads to a dangerous territory in the novel. I still feel you embracing his humanity in some way, finding a way in. Let's talk about community, because there's a sense in this novel, and it haunts me, that we are living in, and I think you've captured it again beautifully. We are living in a time where community is hard to find. And the way we seem to find it these days is in our own tribes, in our own polarized, divided islands. And it is so very clear. So when Claudia goes to work at the clinic, having to go through the protesters, having to pass by people taking pictures, which people can read to find out about that. There's community. There's a camaraderie with the workers in the clinic, the other women. Victor's got a community with his, well, although he's a loner, but with his right-wing hatred. Tim's got a whole nother thing as a drug dealer we can get to. Tim's a great character. But were you aware writing Mercy Street that you are piercing with these characters the very chasm between our divided selves, that we are such a polarized nation right now? And this novel hits on that in so many ways.
You know, it's a novel I wrote during the Trump years, and it's certainly colored by that, without a doubt. I think it's also fair to say that these are very lonely people. All four of these characters are extremely lonely people in a way I think of as completely modern. It's a modern sort of loneliness. You know, we live in an era where it's a very normal thing to live alone. All my characters live alone. I noticed that after I finished writing the book. And that is, you know, was not a common experience 100 years ago. People lived with family, and more of us live alone today. So they are very much people of our time. Victor, who's probably the most isolated of the four of them, finds his community online. And more, that's true for many of us. I mean, a lot of us live a significant part of our lives online, and some people live their entire lives online. And Victor's one of those guys. So is Anthony, to a certain degree. You
know where it shows itself too, Jennifer, is Claudia, who's just such a wonderful character, is living such a modern aloneness. As an educated, she's got a master's in social work, right? She's got a professional job, but her, you know, she has one brief marriage behind her, you know, to a sweet guy named Phil. But her affair, her relationship with Stuart, to me, I think is so emblematic of a lot of modern relationships. Can you speak about that at all without giving too much?
Maybe I should even read a little bit about Stuart.
Would you? I love that description of that love affair, or if you can call it that.
Let me see if I can find Stuart. This will take me a moment. Okay, so Stuart is a guy that Claudia is sort of casually dating, which is the only way Claudia really gets involved with anybody. He is a guy she met online, which is a fairly modern relationship in many ways. So she's leaving the clinic after work. Claudia told him about her day, the Ash Wednesday protesters. Stuart described a promising meeting with a venture capitalist. The unrelatedness of these topics made transitions impossible, so they simply took turns talking. It didn't matter. It was just a courtesy call to confirm their intention to continue sleeping together. Glittering repartee wasn't the point. The terms of their relationship were dictated by traffic. A weeknight date meant sitting in nerve-shattering gridlock, so their in-person contact was limited to alternating weekends when Stuart's ex-wife had the kids. Twice a month, they grilled steaks at his house in the suburbs and had sex several times, a 2-week supply. Claudia excelled at this type of dating. Like a city gardener who grows tiny tomatoes in clay pots, she had realistic expectations. There was a natural limit on how big such plants could grow.
It's just wonderful. Are you aware when you write a passage like that, and I'm sure you, as the writer Paul Ingalls said famously, writing is rewriting what you've already rewritten. But do you feel after a passage like that that maybe you captured something that resonates outward beyond the book?
Yeah, you do have those moments, and that's what keeps you doing it, because most of the time you don't feel that at all. I mean, it is shatteringly difficult even to write a bad novel. So to write anything good is just, it takes extraordinary persistence and a willingness to write bad sentence after bad sentence until you can make them good, you know?
And again, that goes back to the blinders you talked about. You've got to give yourself permission to make it, just keep it yours alone. So you can give yourself permission to write that. Flaubert said famously, a bad book comes from a writer's soul as sincerely as a good one. That is so depressing. So sincerity is not enough? No. Jennifer, I think we should look at the questions, because you've got a lot of wonderfully substantial ones, and I want to leave time for these lovely people. From Ashley Mason, have any of your novels ever been optioned for TV or film? It seems that a TV adaptation is the only way for books to sell well these days. You're my favorite author and think you should be a household name.
Oh, thank you, Ashley. Well, they do get optioned from time to time. Most of my books have been optioned at some point. Nothing ever comes of it, but it's fun. You know, the first time it happened, I really believed, oh, this is going to be a movie. This was my first novel, Mrs. Kimball, and that never happened. But I'm always pleased when they're optioned. I'm always delighted when somebody in the film or television world responds to the story. And who knows, maybe someday it'll work, but not yet.
Dorothy Parker famously said, Hollywood is the only place in the world where you can die of encouragement. Isn't that great? This from Susan Anderson. It could be Chicago too. We're talking about the weather and the snow. The weather and clerical misconduct in the city is very Catholic.
Yeah.
Have you spent much time in Chicago, Jennifer?
Not enough. I like Chicago, but
I can't get over the majesty and size of that place. From Robin Ryan, Robin with a Y, I love your work. I believe I've read all of your books in Baker's Towers twice, and would love to hear anything you could share about how you develop scenes. Do you have a layering process through revision, and how you choose the scenes that feel right to tell your story? Great question. I'm willing to bet Robin is a writer.
Oh, clearly
Yeah.
she is. Well, you know, writing scenes, that's where people reveal themselves. That's where characters reveal themselves. And a mistake I often make in my first drafts is I have people alone on stage too much. You know, I write long scenes of characters running and thinking, or riding a bike and thinking, or, you know, cooking and thinking. And it tends to be very static. So it's something I'm aware of. I have this tendency of writing these long passages of introspection. And sometimes I just force another character into the room just to see what happens, see what they say to each other. And, you know, it's that's the engine of the story. The scene is the engine of the story. What advice I could give about that is cut way back on the dialogue. I always write too much dialogue in the first go on a scene. And, you know, you realize that you're not trying to mimic real speech, which is really not very interesting to read. You're trying to create the illusion of real speech. So it's like real speech, but only brilliant. You know, it's funny or revelatory in a way that we generally are not in real life. So,
you know that great line from Elizabeth Bowden about dialogue? She said, dialogue is what characters do to one another. Isn't that beautiful? Well, let me ask you another question, because your real-time scenes are just always so stunningly vivid and forward-moving and full of veracity. Do you write more than you keep of real-time scenes? Do you find you'll write a few and then toss a few? And
you know, I tend to underwrite things. I was a short story writer before I was a novelist, and so going from the short story form to the novel was really difficult for me. And at the beginning, I erred on the side of terseness always. And even now, I rarely cut a lot. Most of my revisions, it's an additive process rather than a reductive process. So the second draft is longer than the first draft. The third draft is longer than the second draft. I definitely do a lot of cutting on the sentence level. I'll make the sentences shorter and take excess verbiage out of the sentence. But I don't write that many scenes I end up cutting. Still not, very rarely.
For those of you out there who may not have gotten to Jennifer Haigh's wonderful collection of stories, News from Heaven, please do. Just love that. collection. From Sarah Fraley, Jennifer, your female characters are so memorable. Joyce and Dorothy and Rebecca from Bakerton and Sheila from Boston, and yet feel so individual in both first and third person narration. How do you build a character, especially capture their particular voices? That's a great question.
I think a lot about that. Sarah, that's a great question. Sarah also is a writer, can't you tell? One thing I do when I'm writing, I keep running lists of the words my characters like a lot, because we all do this in life, right? We all have certain slang words we use or certain curse words we use, or our vocabularies are actually kind of limited. And so we all have these favorite words that we default to. And when I'm writing a novel, I keep a running list for each of the main characters. What are the words this person, clings to? And that's a really interesting exercise. And it teaches you so much about people's speech. If you think about people in your own life, we all have these kind of expressions that we overuse. And they kind of define us. They reveal a lot about us.
That's great. I'm listening to every word, but I'm actually also, I'm thinking about point of view, because it seems like we have some writers in the room with us. Psychic distance, that term coined by John Gardner, means the distance the reader feels from the events of the story. So this is really at its heart a multiple point of view, third person subjective narrative. And yet you also have a hovering sort of persona who comes in and I think it's so expertly done. And I'll just read up 3 sentences, beginning of chapter 5. The storms kept coming. There was a feeling of meteorological unease. The pigeons of Copley Square woofed their displeasure. At the corner of Mass and Cass, the epicenter of the methadone mile, volunteers handed out blankets. Commuters waited for buses that never came. Schools closed for a day, a week, for 2 weeks, prompting a citywide childcare crisis. In the Savin Hills section of Dorchester, streets were taken over by boys on sleds, and it goes on in this wonderfully kind of hovering, authoritative persona. And then you zoom in to Claudia, or to Timmy, the weed dealer, or to Anthony on the computer. Wow, masterfully done. Speak to that if you would.
Well, it matters where you are. And as you said earlier, sense of place is so important in the things I write. And when people are living inside their small lives, they often don't see what's around them. And so I want an eye in the sky to sort of to place these people in their context and kind of remind the reader where we are. And, a lot of those passages in this book, not surprisingly, deal with the weather, because my God, that winter. So the whole frame of the story is that god awful winter, and it begins at the beginning of winter and ends at the end of winter.
Yeah, beautifully put. From Don Lee, a writer that I know we both admire. I think this is the same Don Lee. I think most writers, whenever they go into a new project, at the very least want to present themselves with a new challenge. Can you think back to what's motivated you technically and intellectually at various points in your career? That's got to be our Don Lee. That's a great question.
It's clearly our Don Lee. I think, I can remember with certain books, I remember very clearly what it was. In Faith, it was the challenge of writing in first person, which I had never thought I could sustain for an entire novel. I've done it in short stories. I enjoy writing in first person, but it's hard. And I never thought I could do a whole novel that way, simply because with a novel and story, there's rarely one character who knows all the good parts. And so in telling the story of Faith, I spent a whole year writing it in the third person. And after that, I realized, no, that's not right. This needs to be a first person story. The challenge with writing Faith, it's a novel about a priest who is accused of molesting a child in his parish. And it's told by the priest's sister, who at the beginning of the story doesn't know whether or not he's guilty. And the challenge in writing that story in first person was that nobody ever knows the truth of these accusations. It all happens behind closed doors. People lie about it. The children are often too traumatized to describe what has happened or not happened. And so I had this first person narrator who was dealing with her doubts about her brother and the impossibility of ever knowing exactly what happened. So it's really, the novel's called Faith, but it's really a novel about doubt. And the technical challenge there was trying to do that in the first person. And, you know, how can she tell this story when she doesn't know all the important parts? And as it turns out, there was a way, but it took me a few years to find it.
I would argue that she took you there because you were locked into her subjectivity, which has its own, those parameters have their own power, certainly in that novel and beyond. From Mary Frances, looks like Bria or Brija, excuse me for the pronunciation. Jennifer, your books are my favorites and I read all of them. Just wondering what was the hardest scene to write and why. I assume she means all the books. Also, I grew up a few towns away from where you grew up and can relate so well to some of your storylines. I met you at the DC Politics and Prose store when you were in town to promote Baker Towers.
Well, the hardest scene. You know, the hardest part of the novel, I can't speak of a particular scene with Mercy Street, but the hardest part of every novel for me, in every case, is writing the end of the story. And I find that so intimidating that the whole first draft is fraught with anxiety for me, because I have this fear, I'm going to write 200-300 pages and I won't figure out the right ending. And, you know, we've all had this experience as readers where you start reading a novel and you fall in love with the first few chapters. You love the characters, you love the writing, and the ending is so bad that it makes you throw the thing across the room. And you're never going to remember that as the novel with a great beginning. You remember it as the novel with the lousy ending. And I've had that experience so many times as a reader, you know?
Oh, it's so true.
Yeah. And so I always fear I'm going to write that novel with a lousy ending. And you know, you don't know till you get there if you're gonna get it right. You know, often I think I know how a story ends, but by the time I've spent a few years with these characters, I realized my idea was stupid and these people would never do that. She would never say that. He would never think that. And so, you know, you figure it out in the process of writing the book. Anytime I've ever thought I knew what the ending was, I was so far off the mark. So
it sounds as if you're saying in broad terms that a solid ending for a novel has to do with character truth primarily.
Completely.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I've thought lately about music too. It seems to me that it's so hard to finish a 500-page narrative, right? It's all got to end. I think of it musically, that whatever instruments have been played in this novel, they all must shimmer somehow in the end. And good luck. It's so hard, but my God, you'd pull it off. This is from Father Brian Clary. As a priest in Boston, I totally agreed that our moral credibility has been lost. Any advice for me as a pastor in diverse, welcoming community? Can you give me some advice? God bless, Father Brian Clary.
Father Brian, thank you for even asking that question. I am so touched by the humility in that question, and the sincerity in that question. You know, I think that the best priests I've ever known, and I've known some really good ones, are priests who really listen to people. And, you know, nuns and priests were absolutely the heroes of my childhood. I went to all these years of Catholic school and I felt so cared for and so listened to by priests as a child. And the less good priests I've known don't do that. So it's having a listening ear. And I think Father Brian already has that because he even asked that question.
And he's clearly reading fiction, so that can only help, right? Thank you, Father Brian. From Dimphny Dronick, it looks like, empathy is such an essential element of helping us avoid the very human penchant for tribalism. Beautifully said. I think this whole audience is full of writers. Us hating them. How do you manage to protect yourself from becoming polarized in the divisive world? I feel like story is a magical antidote.
Oh, what a great question from Dimphny, which is not surprising. I've been interviewed by Dimphny before. She always asks great questions. You know, I think it really comes down to remembering that everybody is more than one thing. Every person who ever lived is more than their worst moment and not as good as their best moment. You know, we all contain all of those things. And I tell this to my students when I teach creative writing all the time. If you write a character who's defined by a single characteristic, that you wrote a flat character and that's not a person, that's an idea. That's you trying to make a point as a writer. And people are complicated. People are full of contradictions.
And it seems to me the way to avoid that, and I'd like your opinion, is you must be genuinely curious about their situation. You must be genuinely curious about what it's like to be them. And I always feel this in your work. I always feel that you're writing with an open, non-judgmental, egoless state where you're just trying to enter into their private skin to live as them. And it seems
Completely.
Yeah.
Completely. I've had this lifelong fantasy of wanting to be invisible in order to observe people when they don't know they're being watched. And that sounds creepy. And the only outlet I have found for this, the only healthy, socially acceptable outlet for this, is writing fiction, because it really is the best technology we have to get inside somebody else's mind and heart. There is no better way to do it. Journalism can't do it. Nonfiction writing can't do it. You can only do this in fiction to have full access to somebody else's consciousness. And it feels to me like, I don't know why everybody doesn't write fiction and why everybody doesn't read fiction, because we only get one life, and that is the tragedy of being human, is you only get to be one person. You only get one point of view, one set of experiences. You get one life. The only way to cheat and get more lives is to read fiction, to get inside other people's lives and live vicariously. It's the only way you can really do it.
Amen, sister. An acting friend of mine who went to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London, his teacher said to him after performance, Paul, that was good, but it wasn't great. So what do you mean it wasn't great? And his teacher said, well, Paul, what can I tell you? None of us are one note. We are all a symphony. From Susan Anderson, what writers today and of the past do you admire, and are you zooming from your home office?
Yes, I'm zooming from my home office. The writers I admire, that's such a very long list. And the list changes daily. It's almost like the soup of the day, kind of. So if you ask me this question tomorrow, I would answer it differently. But the first writers come to mind are ones I've read recently. I am completely awestruck by Faulkner, and also by Toni Morrison, and I think of them very much as companion writers. They are, I think, the two most eloquent writers of the American experience that I've read, and they're very, they're writing about some of the same places, from different points of view, but I think they are companion writers, and they are best read side by side. So those two are at the very top of my list. I love the Irish writer William Trevor. He's about the only writer I can think of who's equally good at the novel and the short story. It's funny, we think of him as a great short story writer, and he was. But had he not written those short stories, we'd think of him as the great Irish novelist, William Trevor, because his novels are just as good. Almost nobody can do that, to be that perfectly ambidextrous. So he is high on my list as well. Canadian writer Alice Munro, for whom I feel nothing but awe, certainly. So those are kind of some of the Hall of Fame writers for me. I would add Andre Dubus, Père et Fils, both high on my list. And I'm continually discovering new people who are doing surprising things. I just read the new novel by Jasmine Chan, The School for Good Mothers, debut novel. It's terrifically imaginative, and just fully real. So
it's so encouraging. There's so much great new work being written. I don't want to embarrass you with praise, but Jennifer, I think you're just as ambidextrous with the short form and the long. Clearly, you are a novelist through and through. Your canvases are large, they're ambitious, they're brave. You take on all sorts of thematic strands, and you do it through live flesh and blood characters. But my God, your short stories are poems. And so I would just add that. From Wynne Cooper, I don't have a question. By the way, we love Wynne Cooper. If you haven't read Wynne Cooper's poems, go read the poet Wynne Cooper. I don't have a question. I just want to say that if anyone watches this interview and doesn't buy Jennifer's book, I'll just assume they got buried in a snowstorm. let's go down to Robin Ryan. Again, I would love to hear what you were both working on, if you're comfortable talking about it. Also, Andre, I remember well the talk you gave at the last Muse held in person. And then she praised me, and I can't read it because I get embarrassed. But thank you, Robin. Well, I would assume, Jennifer, you're not working on anything yet, but maybe not, right? Because there's a lag time between when you deliver a book to your publisher and when it comes out. Are you at work?
I am writing short stories now, and I am having the best time. You know, I think of like writing a novel is kind of like a long bad marriage, and a short story is like dating. So if it doesn't work out, oh well. So I've been playing with some short stories. I'm having a really good time with them.
That is fantastic. I just finished a new novel and a collection of essays, and they're coming out in the next little while. And
Do you sleep ever? Ever?
Yeah, no,
No, not really.
There was a fun question earlier that I just skipped over because it brought me into the conversation. I want to talk more about Mercy Street, but we have quick minute. How would you compare the characters in The Garden of Last Days, one of my novels, and Mercy Street? Intensely, this is from Marie Bova, intensely drawn and seemingly focused solely in their own thoughts, with these characters been friends. Marie, that's a great question. I'll turn it over to Jennifer Haigh.
Oh, I love The Garden of Last Days. And I see all sorts of strands connecting those two books. And, one of them being isolated men, very isolated. And, my novel is certainly populated by isolated men, but I see that in that novel as well. And wow, Andre, you're really good at writing those isolated men. Your last novel in particular, Gone So Long, which is just a complete masterpiece for those who haven't read it. That is just about the best lonely man I have read in recent memory.
Well, thank you. When I think about your men, in all your novels and in your short stories. There's a lot of, let me pull back here. Are the men more isolated than the women in our work, Jennifer? I'm not sure. I think maybe. Certainly in this new novel, Mercy Street, the men are more isolated than Claudia's got a. I love that Claudia goes and sits in her her weed dealer's apartment, gets high with him, watches whatever's on TV. It's one of the sweetest parts of this novel. But that moment highlighted for me her isolation in a lot of ways. That this is really her social life is getting high with her weed dealer before going back to her apartment alone.
Completely. I mean, Timmy is like, he's like a sort of a first responder in her life in a way, that he's kind of the person she turns to. Beyond that, her real community is the people she works with. Right. And, part of that is the experience of doing a kind of work that most people don't really understand. There's a thing keeps happening to Claudia in the course of the novel. People keep saying to her, I don't know how you can work there. Mm-hmm. And in fact, most people don't know how you can work there. It's such a singular experience that I think she has a hard time connecting with people who don't know what that world is. And outside her coworkers, Timmy is without a doubt her closest connection.
It's one of those really sweet moments of the novel where you find yourself reaching for some comfort as the reader, and you get it, and then you don't, and then you do. I think we should end with some of these wonderful, just congratulations. This is from the great Lisa Genova. Mercy Street is a masterclass. Brava, love you both. Love you too, Lisa. From Karen Watkins, a wonderful writer with whom I've worked many times. Exceptional empathy and synergy, Boston Catholicism, Snowpocalypse, and all four main characters in Mercy Street too. Great reinforcement. Yes, fiction is the only way we can have full access to someone else's consciousness. Agree. And so we cheat, as you say, reading quality fiction. We're able to live so many lives, rich and lucky. As for being a household name, I thought Jennifer Haigh is a household name, at least in most households I've known. I totally agree. Let's leave it on that. Fellow human beings, you can buy this at Books and Books. You can buy it at Politics and Prose. You can buy it at Harvard Bookstore. You can buy it anywhere but Amazon. For some reason, you guys, I'm not a fan of Amazon. I'm just going to say, buy it from your locally independently owned bookstore. Jennifer Haigh, bravo.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Andre. Andre, I think you should become, the agent for all indies everywhere. And Jennifer, congratulations on a fabulous book and a compelling story. And thank you to all the 100+ folks who joined in from wherever you are, from Iowa to Florida to wherever else you are. Thank you all. Good night and bad luck. Right?
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, everybody.
Take care, y'all.
Peace.